Hi folks, my name is Mike Dobbs and thank you for tuning in to another edition of Government Matters here on Focus Springfield. Today I have the pleasure and the privilege of speaking to the Vice Chair of the Springfield School Committee, LaTonia Naylor. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I just want to, I'll ask you a question about numbers first, because I was thinking about this as I was driving in. Have we come back to being the #2 largest school district in the Commonwealth? Because we were #2 for many years, and then I heard Worcester had gone ahead of us. So
They did, but I believe we're back to #2.
Okay.
And you're right. It's only a few hundred students that make the difference between Worcester being 2 or us being 2. So as of now, my assumption is we're 2. But when I want to say in May or so, we get, or maybe it's March. They get the M's confused, but one of those, we get the updates of the numbers, and then we'll know for sure at that point.
The reason I bring something like that up to start our discussion is I want people to understand basically how important the school committee is. We're #2. That means the only other school district in the state that's larger is Boston.
Absolutely.
So Springfield as a district is very much a leader, even if we're #3. But we're not. We're #2. And what happens at the school committee, what happens with the superintendent, what happens with the teachers and the paraprofessionals and everyone really sets a tone for the state.
Absolutely.
Looking at what we do and how we do it and how we accomplish educating our kids, overcoming a lot of obstacles that a gateway city like Springfield has. I mean, it really matters. And that's why I enjoy covering the school committee and watching your meetings, because I'm learning about how this group of people have attacked these problems to try to give our kids the best public education that they can get.
Absolutely. I love what you're saying, and I will say this, even though in size we're #2, in a lot of issues we're #1. So we're the first to have universal preschool for our pre-K3 and pre-K4. We're the first to have art, music assigned to all the schools. And we were the first to have all of our technology before COVID. So most districts didn't have one-to-one for their kids. We did, with the exception of the kids that are in the lower levels of elementary, which we got them iPads or whatever the case was during COVID. But we are first in many ways. When you look at our teacher pipeline that we created through our Reach to Teach and these different programs that we have, we're the first to do those things. And so Boston might have us in size, but they definitely don't have us when it comes to creativity and strategy, and a lot of that has come because of the fact that we've always had limited resources. And so when you look at Boston, they have more money than they can even think about using, and most of the time it's a mismanagement of funds that you might hear about when it comes to them. With us, for many years we were at a deficit. Some years we were at -$20 million going into the year and trying to figure out how do we still accommodate the needs of our kids, knowing that we're -$20 million. These days we're better because of SOA funds, Student Opportunity Act, and ARPA and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, we're always thinking about how do we be creative in being able to provide this opportunity for our kids to have access to equitable education. And we're not where we need to be by any stretch of the imagination, but I will say we're a far cry away from the 50% graduation rate we had a little bit over 10 years ago.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because our graduation rate was shameful. Kids were just dropping out of school left and right. For any number of reasons. And there's been an incredible turnaround.
Absolutely.
In graduation rates, dropout rates, attendance, because we had a real attendance problems. Kids weren't coming to school, basically.
And suspension was huge. It was very bad. And arrests were very bad at that time. The numbers have since improved, and it's not because we blinked in 10 years past. It's because it took a lot of work between the district, community partners, policies that we had to really go back in. So when you talk about suspensions, one of the issues were that young people were being suspended for reasons that just didn't make sense. And so the school committee had to take a hard look at what the policies were and what was happening and why were kids getting suspended. Well, if kids continue to get suspended, they're going to lose interest. They're not coming back to school. So that was one of the reasons why we saw such a huge dropout rate and a lack of students graduating. But then other pieces came to play, such as increasing our diversity hires and putting more funding around community resources and engagement. And like I said, the arts and stuff like that was just huge. And so although I can absolutely hear the person listening to this conversation say, hey, but what about this and what about that? I would say you're right. We still have holes. But I can tell you right now, what I walked into 5 years ago and what I'm looking at now is not the same situation. It's a much better situation. And I think we're going to continue to improve.
Covering school committee as I have over a number of years, it's not always easy for a layperson to understand because the district has done things like the empowerment zone. And so you really have to explain what that means and what it means. And correct me, please, if I get this wrong. So the empowerment zone is about our middle schools.
Yes, so almost.
Okay.
It initially came into play because our middle schools were failing. And we had an ultimatum from the state. Either we go into this empowerment zone agreement or they take over the entire district like they did in Holyoke, and we decided we didn't want receivership, that it was really a problem with the middle school for whatever reason. There's a lot of complex reasons for that. And so we allowed this organization to come in and partner with us to take over most of our middle schools. We have one or two, I think, that are not in the empowerment zone. But then now Commerce is also a part. So we do have high schools that are also a part. And Chestnut now has a high school, and Van Sickle has a high school. So they are also part of the empowerment zone as well.
And again, correct me if I'm wrong, the empowerment zone allows greater latitude for the principals and those kinds level of administrators in addressing what they see as the needs of the students and strategies to meet those needs.
Absolutely. And so because of the autonomy that they have, they were able to make decisions, and some hard decisions. So I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was a big issue about one of the schools not wanting to use echoes. And it was huge, and people were really upset. How could you not use echoes and all these things? But the school said, hey, I can do what I want with my budget, and why should I pay for echoes when UMass wants to come in for free and do the same program or a similar program? We'd rather take that money and use it for something else. And they were able to do that because they were in the empowerment zone. And so there are certain times when it may not be politically, tasty to be more appetizing, but at the end of the day, they get to make the decisions that they think are best for the students and staff in their buildings. They also get more flexibility as to how much they pay their staff. So you'll find in the empowerment zone schools that staff get paid a little bit more than the traditional schools for various reasons. People may agree or disagree with that, but I understand why they feel that that's important to do. But I would say one of the benefits that have come out of that is a lot of our staff in the traditional schools have said, well, if they're getting all that autonomy, Mr. Superintendent, what about us? Why can't we make more choices? And so through that process, the superintendent and the finance team came up with the strategy to allow not just the schools who are in the empowerment zone, but also our other principals to be able to say, hey, we want to choose what we do and what we don't do. Certain things are district-wide, but there's a lot of things that they can make decisions to purchase or not purchase, or a number of staff to have for certain things versus not, depending on the needs of their building.
We've been pretty lucky in Springfield. I don't know if luck is the right word, but we're pretty lucky that we've received an awful lot of money through the Massachusetts School Building Authority. I think it was, like $750 million or so far?
Lots and lots of money.
And I think that, I think that people probably didn't fully understand just how antiquated our school buildings were, our basic infrastructure for education, the physical buildings. And at your meeting last week, you guys voted to send the letter of intent about Harena. You also mentioned, memory of an old man here. White Street and Washington.
Yes.
And in fact, when I did my story, I called up the superintendent's office because I know that White Street was built in 1908, and I didn't know how old Washington was. It was 1918.
Yes.
So we're talking about two schools that are well over a century old. What kind of challenge does this pose? I mean, we've made so much progress in getting newer buildings, but we still have a lot of kids going to these neighborhood type schools that are ancient. What kind of challenge does that pose when you're sitting on the school committee and you're talking about the facilities that teachers are in and what they have there to actually help them do their task?
Wow, it's hard, and I admit, like, if it was up to me, White Street would have been number one, right? That's where my kids went, and all of that, and I love White Street. But I absolutely understood the need for Harena, and I think that what people really need to understand is that it's not just the building, but it does have a big part to play, right? When young people have access to updated technology and resources, they're able to learn things that are really relevant to today, whereas the schools who don't have access to that have to figure out creatively how do we still get to the same place, and be able to have kids still get the same learning outcomes without having access to that technology. So it really puts a lot of hardship on our principals, on our educators to try to navigate what that looks like and how we can do that and accomplish those goals. I think that as we are able to look at the older buildings and start to get those offline and be able to get more buildings in that are more relevant to the needs of today, I think that becomes less of a problem, but it also still doesn't take away the fact that the principals and the educators need to be really in tune with making sure that it's not just about the building. And I talk about White Street because one of the things that I brought up in the meeting last week was that my experience at that school pre the staff that are there now and now with the staff that are there was just night and day. And the experience for a lot of families were very different. And so when my oldest was there nobody would show up to open house. I mean, we were there and 3 parents showed up, and my husband and I were 2 of the 3 parents, and a class of 30 kids, you know, and that is just, to think about why wouldn't people show up to their kids' open house, right? There's a lot of reasons why, but the fact that I showed up and it was 3 parents was just telling me a tale of how families felt about the environment. When my son went there, my youngest daughter, we had so many parents at open house that they literally had to have us lined up outside the door, and we had to use bingo cards, and they had to find creative ways to give us a schedule to get in to see our teachers at certain times so we all could be satisfied that we were able to come in and speak to the teachers. That is not something that's only about the building, right? As old as that building is,
right,
the staff have figured out how do we engage with the families in a way that they want to be a part of this, and how do we meet the kids where they are, that the kids want to be a part too. And to me, that is everything, you know. So if I had to put all my money into how do we create the culture versus the technology, I would absolutely go for that first. But I think being able to have both means that the experience is just so much more richer for our kids, and that they're going to have the intellectual aptitude to be able to match, if not challenge, those
right
around us who have other access that they don't have access to.
A lot of people probably remember a time when White Street School had a bad reputation. And since then, I mean, I'm trying to remember, it's the National Blue Ribbon.
Yes.
They won this incredible accolade, a national accolade for their academic achievements. So you're absolutely right. Having the right people, given the right budget, they can overcome maybe a facility and have a school that kids can thrive in.
Right.
So let's talk about Harena for a little bit. So if I remember correctly, the letter that you folks sent to the School Building Authority was about the HVAC for the school, because Harena has had real issues with
Yes.
things like mold. And obviously this is a great concern to kids' health, to the faculty's health, the
Right.
staff's health. Are you guys hopeful that the state's going to come through for that?
Well, I'll tell you, we want to be able to get the new building, period. Like, that building, it's just, it's constantly putting Band-Aids on issues to make sure that it's safe enough for people to be in at this point. And I think the HVAC thing that we voted on is part of the Band-Aid of making sure that it remains safe for people to be in.
So you'd like to see a whole new
We want
building.
a whole building. So we had 2 votes on that day about Harena. One was around the HVAC system, but the other part of it was, can we get a new building? And if they prefer for us to get a new building, which they may say, rather than give you all, you know, $500,000 or whatever, $1 million, whatever it's going to cost to be able to fix that system, how about we talk about, you know, giving you a new building? We'd rather get the building. But I know that even still, our goal is always to make sure folks are safe. So whatever it takes to make sure folks remain safe, I think that that is something that we are absolutely going to stay on, you know, because when you look at the air quality or the other things that potentially are a risk if we continue to have those other issues at Harena, then hands down, the 1908 establishment at White Street or 1918 in Washington or even Bill, it really is irrelevant because at least those buildings are safe for people to be in every day.
Right, right. I think Harena is a great example of a well-intentioned inner city experiment that physically, the physical nature of the building and where it is. I mean, for years I had no idea there was this tunnel.
None of us knew.
And then I was assigned to a story about the tunnel leaking, so I went into the tunnel and it was like, I didn't fully realize that this was, so I get the idea behind it. It was like, okay, so we're going to unite these neighborhoods that basically have been separated through the interstate.
Right.
I get it, and it's well intentioned, but clearly it doesn't work on a very elementary physical basis.
No, they missed a lot of things at DOT when they put that in place, and it was sad that it took so many years for them to finally own up to their responsibility in it and finally do what they had to do. And a lot of the issues continue to be exacerbated because we had to wait on DOT to do their part, and a lot of people didn't know. So one thing that I could say that Maria Perez did as a school committee member was making sure that she really got the community engaged to get them educated on what the real problem was and that they knew who to target their anger to, because a lot of times people, again, if they're not educated as to who's responsible for what, then they come after the wrong person upset and not realizing it's not my responsibility. Like, I can help advocate with you, but I don't make that decision. I don't make that final decision. So she was able to get hundreds of people in her community really, I don't want to say excited. They were angry at first, but they got excited as they started to see the progress of what could happen and the change that could occur. And now if you go over there, you look at the tunnel and everything that's been rebuilt, and it's like sensible, it's safe. Like, this is what it should have been all the time. Why didn't we have this for people that they had to walk all the way around along a highway because it was safer than just going through a tunnel that should have been safer? And so unfortunately, it took all of that to get DOT to finally recognize what they needed to do. But now, then we did our part as a city and as a school board. But yeah, at the end of the day, like I said, it's Band-Aids on top of a situation that was very bad. And we look forward to being able to get rid of that building and getting another building in another space.
Sure, sure. Well, when you have a problematical building like that, it does affect the kids and it does affect the staff. I find it very interesting that Springfield has been able to bring back, you know, arts and music into schools, because so many schools for so long across the country was cutting arts and music. Do you think it's making a big difference with the students to have that element of education offered to them?
I absolutely do. And it's funny, we made the mandate a few years ago, and even then I still have found that some of the schools are struggling because of staffing and trying to find teachers, that all of the kids are still not getting a full experience. And you can look at the data for the schools where it's not happening or it's not happening as much and see a difference in how the kids are dealing, whether it's social emotionally, whether it's academically. The arts are just such a key aspect of a child's growth and development. And I know for me, and the reason why I advocated for it so strongly was that I had to have arts to be able to come through my child. I had such a traumatic experience as a young person, and having the outlet of music was what really spared me, I think, from doing a lot of things that I probably would have done had
Sure.
I not had that outlet. And before I had the outlet, there were some things I did that I'm not proud of, you know? And I feel like a lot of our kids who are living in these situations and poverty and communities that are just overridden with crime and violence, that they don't know the norm is not to be violent in response to what people are doing, because that's what they're seeing and they think that's what they should do. They think that's the right way to do, join a gang for protection or whatever the case may be. But when you start to recognize there's a channel and a place you can go to in your privacy of your home and draw or paint or have music or write, now you have something to be able to channel that anger and that frustration out into a beautiful masterpiece that other people can respect and receive, and then you didn't go out and punch that person in the face or end up in
Right.
jail or hustle or whatever, because now you're able to tell your story and articulate in a way that's really powerful, meaningful
Right.
for people. And so I really see the vessel of art and music as this channel for young people that really just need a place to release. And I think in our other communities that are wealthier, they figured that out, right? They know that art and music is so important. As a matter of fact, I had a parent tell me, there's 3 things I mandated for my kids. They had to play a sport, they had to play an instrument, and there was one other thing, volunteer. They had to volunteer. They didn't have to be good at the sport, they didn't have to be good at the music, but they made them do it because there were certain fundamental skills that you learn from being part of those kinds of experiences. And if we're not allowing our kids to have access to that, how do they gain those transferable skills that are then going to be used later in life? So I can go on and on about it. I do a lot of research around art and music, but it's something powerful for me when I sit in a room with a child and we go through a summer program together and they're given this artistic tool, and then they come out of it and now they're talking and they feel
Right.
comfortable and they want to express themselves, and that is such a key part. And in 6 weeks I can do that with a kid in the after summer program. Imagine what happens over years of access and opportunity for kids. And we see it at SciTech, we see the way those kids are in the band, we see it at the conservatory, how they just won a competition. There was like, I guess, 3 prizes, and they came in first with one aspect of the talent program.
Oh, this was the a cappella.
Yes,
Yeah.
the a cappella event. And they only had 3 weeks to practice. But because those kids have been used to being able to use that and channel that, and they've been learning that at the conservatory, they took that and they ran with it, and they placed against people who spent a lot of money to do this. So it's really just being able to tap into that aspect of them. It's just great potential. Anyways, so as you can tell.
Well, no, I got to ask you also something, and you brought it up at the beginning about the amount of food service that is afforded to children in Springfield. I've done a couple stories over there at the Culinary Center, and I want to tell you the quality of food that place produces. It's certainly a lot better than the American chop suey that I got every week at my schools.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's sort of night and day. I mean, you guys are doing like farm to table stuff. Do you think that that's made a real difference for the students and for these families to have this resource?
Absolutely. And you know, now you kind of got my brain going, and we should ask for some data on this, but I would assume if we had data on it, which we may, that if we looked at the data on the kids before they had access to this better quality food, and then now, that we would see a difference in their functionality and a lot of other things, because we know if kids are eating a bunch of sugar, they're not processing their energy levels, the way that they're handling things and responding to things. I had sugar last night and I was like running around with my dog in the middle of the living room, you know? It's like, what are you gonna do with all this energy?
Right.
And so by giving them good quality food that doesn't have all of the extra stuff in it, it really allows for them to process. Mentally, it helps. Like, there's so many healthy things that come out of, healthy outcomes that come out of this experience of giving them better quality food, which is why we have invested so much money in it, and why I'm totally like committed to advocating that we continue to operate at that high level. When we were unable due to COVID to provide the food that we can provide now, we had so many complaints. And mostly because people were used to the quality of what they got before COVID. So they're like, what happened? Like, what went down? And it was not our fault. You know, it was a state requirement and mandates and things that it was out of our control as to how they packaged the food and how it was prepared in the cafeterias and whatnot. But it still really brought home for us the fact that the expectation of what we can provide has just, it increased so much so that people were not like, oh wow, yeah, we're used to this. They're like, no, like what happened? Like we want what you guys did before, like bring it back. And now that they're getting it, I have not had one complaint. No, I had one. I had one and it was about milk. It had nothing to do with the food. The kid was like, oh, this milk, I don't like this milk. But other than that, no complaints about the food. And I think that's a testament to your point that they recognize the quality and they ask to take it home. A lot of the kids will say, hey, there's muffins left, can I bring these home? Or there's extra food left over, can I take it home, rather than it going in the trash? And I'm not going to say that people are told they can do that, but I'm pretty sure people are not throwing the food away, you know, because people want it and they need it.
Absolutely. All right, well, you know, my boss over here, Steve Carey, always likes me to ask people about how they made the decision to go into this kind of public service, to run for an office here in Springfield, and then to serve. So what was your motivation?
Wow, I guess if you watched the vice chair speech that I gave, to me that summed it up very articulately, you know, that it all went back to my children, you know, and I was a mom who, funny, I started thinking about my involvement in government relations, and I was literally in like middle school in the student government. Like I started out very young with this mindset of I want to change the world and I think I need to go into politics, and when I graduated I changed my mind and decided to go into social work and then business and then back into nonprofit, right? Because who knows what they want to do when they're young. But I remember thinking like, maybe I want to be a mayor or a senator or something one day, but I don't know how to get there. That's impossible. So I kind of put the idea to rest when I was going into college, but it wasn't until my son was having issues in school that I really stepped it up and got more involved. I got on the CEDM team and involved with the PTO at the school and everything, and I'm just like, no, they gotta get better. And it wasn't until the White Street experience that we had the second go around that I realized the schools can change. You know, we don't have to go to a charter school or a private school to have an experience that's positive for our children, where they can actually get something that's tangible that they can take home with them. That the times that I lived in are not just gone. Like, we got great education when we were coming up. Like, we can have that still these days. And that's what motivated me. I said, if White Street can change, any school can change. And I want to be a part of that change, and I want to inspire that change. And that's what made me run for office. My friend, Dr. McFadden, moved. His seat opened up, and I met with him, and I said, I think I want to run for your seat. He's like, are you sure? I'm like, yeah, I think I do. And he gave me some pointers and things I should be aware of. And from there, I just started running. And before I knew it, I had people following me, wanting to help me, and we got the job done. And so after my first term, I would say I ran again. Not necessarily just for my child or my children, but I thought about the other children. At that point, it was like, yeah, I ran because of my kids in the beginning, but now what about all the families that I'm able to help being in this space, being at the table, and sometimes forcing my way into the table. Even though I'm voted into the space, as a Black woman, I recognize that I'm not always invited to be at every dinner party. So you kind of make yourself get invited, you know, because you understand that it's necessary to advocate for all of our children, regardless of their abilities, regardless of their race, regardless of their sexual orientation or their religion. Like, all of our children need to be thought about, and they need to have somebody who has them in mind whenever we're making any decisions.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on and talking. And folks, you really ought to watch the school committee. If you have a child or a grandchild or a niece or nephew in the Springfield school system, you ought to tune in here to Focus Springfield and watch the school committee meetings, because you're going to hear a lot of interesting discussions, and also you're going to learn a lot about what is happening in our schools and how teachers and administrators are working together to try to give the very best to our students here in Springfield. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for watching this edition of Government Matters.